I did it. But thank you, everybody, for your patience and good morning. And thanks to Lauren and all of you for going with the flow. It is great to see everybody. Welcome to this class that I'm calling Freedom for What? Biblical and Cultural Perspectives on Liberty. I'm Julia Mitchener, for those of you that may not know me, and I'm one of the clergy here at the Cathedral of St. Philip. And first of all, I just want to say again how great it is to see everybody. I have missed you all so much, and I have really missed our in-person gatherings at the Cathedral. More than I can say. And I know a lot of you, a number of you are old-fashioned Sunday school regulars, maybe all of you, but just in case we have anybody who is here as a visitor or newcomer, maybe you just happened upon this sort of thus far zany Zoom meeting, or maybe you have been worshiping online with us at the Cathedral since mid-March. But if you consider yourself a visitor or a newcomer in any way, shape, or form, I want to welcome you especially, but it's good to be with you all. I know Dan Murphy and Lauren had said that it would be helpful to go through a few logistics in terms of how we'll be proceeding this morning. Is that, Lauren, do you think that's still helpful, or do we have pretty much?
Just in case we have some new faces this morning, just to know that the practice is to try to be muted during the class, and then if you have, there will be a time for questions, and you can unmute yourself and kind of self-monitor during that time. If you accidentally unmute yourself just from walking around your house and pressing a button, I'll mute you, not because I don't want to hear from you, but just to make it easier for everyone to be able to hear what's going on. And that's it.
Okay, great. That's it. That's right. And if Lauren, we're going to have, and everybody, we're going to have maybe a little bit more opportunity for discussion than is sometimes the case today, because I really want to hear from everybody. And I know sometimes, at least my experience on these Zoom calls, is that it can be kind of hard to break in and to figure out when it's a good time to unmute yourself. Some people are quicker on the draw. It's kind of like in Jeopardy, you know, when one person wins because they just have really quick reflexes. Well, nobody has to win that way. So people can use the chat button, correct, Lauren, if they have something they'd like to say or ask a question and they're having a hard time breaking in, feel free to use the chat button.
Yeah, I'll monitor the chat.
Okay, very good, thank you. And my apologies, because of my technological challenges, I'm gonna be looking back and forth. But you've got the slideshow up now, Lauren. You could, oh no, that's right, sorry, okay. I'm going to use the slideshow. I'm sorry you won't have benefit of it. But it's, for the most part, there were a few pictures and paintings and things, but other than that, you won't be missing a lot, so I apologize. Anyway, today on this Sunday after Independence Day, we're going to be talking about freedom. And specifically, I'm going to invite us to look at ideas about freedom as they are presented in the Bible, and then to explore how these understandings may compare and contrast with some of our postmodern Western and specifically American ideas. First, just a little bit of background. I got started thinking about this topic a few weeks ago when I saw a provocative headline in the New York Times. It read, "Bars, strip clubs, and churches. U.S. enters virus's unwieldy phase." Bars, strip clubs, and churches. I love that. It's not every day that churches and strip clubs get lumped in together. Anyway, the article, as you can imagine, was basically talking about how dangerous it can be these days to go in places where a lot of people are congregating together, where people are sitting closely together and talking a lot and talking loudly. And it was also about, though, how upset a lot of Americans have been getting when they hear from public health officials or government officials in some parts of the country who are discouraging them from going to strip clubs and churches, and even telling them that they can't go, that these places where they want to go are either closed or in some cases are closing again. And it seems, according to this article, that to many Americans, this is experience on their freedom. So anyway, I've also been thinking about this whole mask issue, and the question of to mask or not to mask has over the past month or so become a huge topic of conversation in many circles, right? I mean, it seems to be the topic du jour. It may seem like it shouldn't be controversial, but it's because it seems to a lot of us to be simply a matter of public health, but somehow it's been become a touchstone, I think, for a lot of our collective anger and hurt and frustration and mistrust, you name it. And I have to admit that I'm simultaneously sort of fascinated, but also horrified by how big the masking question has become. Again, in many ways, it seems like a simple issue. While initially the general public was encouraged, was told we didn't need to wear masks, that it wouldn't help. In fact, we were actively discouraged from sort of snatching up extra masks. But now the best medical science seems to suggest that masking can really help. It can help save lives. It can go a long way towards flattening the curve and slowing the spread of COVID-19. It might make it easier for schools to open in the fall, which I have to say is something in which I am highly, highly invested. It might even, Forbes magazine reported the other day, help, if we all mask up, it might help save up to 5% of the GDP from being lost. So lots of good reasons to wear a mask. I'm really not here to, I have my own opinions about masking, and I suspect you do too, and I'm not here to debate that today, but just as a way of getting into our conversation, all these questions about regulations during this time of COVID, to mask or not to mask. Should the governor simply recommend that we mask up, or should the governor, as the governors of some states have done, regulate masking? Should people be able to choose whether to go to certain places where there may be large crowds, or should those places be shut down again? And all these questions have gotten me thinking about the topic of freedom as we understand it in our postmodern American culture, and freedom as it is presented as an ideal in the Bible. Okay, so we're going to start out by talking about freedom as it does appear as a theme in the Old and New Testaments, and we're going to be talking about, again, how those ideas of freedom as presented in the Bible may complement or conflict with our American ideals of freedom. For example, the rights of each person to be self-determining. What does the Bible say about this? Does it say anything about it? Does it support this understanding of self-determination that is such an important part of our understanding of what freedom means, I think, in Western society? If it does, then what does that mean for us as Americans, who also happen to be people, as Christians, for whom the Bible is an important set of documents, a guiding force in how we try to live our lives? So these are some of the issues I want to invite us to look at today. And obviously, I mean, we could spend a year on this topic. And what we're going to do today is obviously going to need to be cursory. And we can come back and talk some more about this next week if you'd like, or we can veer off into a somewhat different, but I think related subject. And I have some ideas about that I'll talk about towards the end of the class. For right now, though, I want to just start us off by asking each person who's in the meeting to take just a couple of moments to think about what freedom means to you. Maybe just a few words or images that come to mind when you think about the meaning of freedom. And if you have a slip of paper, you want to jot down some notes, that's great. If not, just sort of hold your words or images that come to mind. Hold those in your mind. So let's take a moment to think. Okay, would anybody like to unmute yourself and share? a bit about any words or images that have come to your mind in terms of what freedom means?
Barbara Pendergrass has said spaciousness.
Spaciousness. Barbara, I actually was thinking myself this morning as I went, it came into a day, whatever this is, of the whole fam being together, since mid-March. And I was thinking about spaciousness too. Yeah, so spaciousness, space for your body. I was also thinking about this actually at Walgreens the other day. The issue of the checkout line, when people don't always necessarily respect the 6 feet of distance there, and sort of how to handle that. But I was also thinking about it in regards to my children, whom I adore, but my daughter especially loves to be in my space, and I love that most of the time, but not always. So spaciousness, yeah. Anybody else?
Let's see. Jennifer Rosenblatt says cars and roads.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Cars and roads.
Ah, cars and roads. Okay. Gail?
I don't see anybody raising their hand.
Oh, okay. Gail, I think.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, it will.
Oh, there we go.
I can hear you now, Gail.
Right. My first reaction is my freedom ends where yours begins. I have to be considerate of other people. So that's why I should not run into your car, or should wear a mask, or should not do some violent thing.
Okay, great. Absolutely. Yes. Okay, well, thank you all for that. Just hold whatever words and images came to your mind. Hold those in your mind as we go through this session. But let's turn now to the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about freedom? First of all, I think it's important to note that the word freedom itself doesn't appear very much in the Bible at all, almost none at all in the Old Testament, and very seldom in the New Testament. But the concept of freedom is a big theme in the Bible nonetheless. The most prominent story of the Old Testament, and one that actually becomes such a huge motif that it carries over into the New as well. It's really a story that shapes not only so much of the Old Testament, but the New Testament, and so much Christian thought and practice that it would be really impossible, I think, to overestimate its importance. And that is the story of course, the Exodus, the liberation of God's chosen people, the Hebrew people being set free from their captivity in Egypt. And as I said, it's not just the story, it's really a metaphor of sorts that when you think about it, if you think about our Episcopal liturgy, it's a metaphor and story that we draw from in a lot of our liturgy, in the Easter Vigil, for example, in the baptismal service. So what about God, and what about freedom does the story of the Exodus tell us? Well, first of all, I think that the story of the Exodus tells us about God and about freedom, that God is primarily, for the Hebrew people, a liberator. That's who God is portrayed as being in Hebrew scriptures, as a liberator. That's God's key role. God is one who sets the captives free. And so, for example, in Exodus 20, verse 2, we read, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." I am the Lord your God. My identity is as the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And interestingly, this theme of God as one who liberates, God as one who frees human beings from oppression, is carried into Jesus's self-identity. If you think about the 4th chapter of Luke's gospel, for example, when Jesus proclaims his mission as being, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, and he sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. So this understanding of God as liberator carries over very powerfully into the ministry of Jesus in the New Testament. But back to the Hebrew scriptures, all these passages, I'm going to read a couple more. Here's one from Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 8. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And then in Exodus chapter 6, verse 7, I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the burdens of the Egyptians. So all these passages demonstrate clearly that according to the Old Testament, what freedom means is freedom from oppression, freedom from bondage, freedom from slavery, freedom from being enslaved to other human beings, which all sounds pretty reasonable. Doesn't sound terribly alien, does it? But then I think things get a little tricky. What do I mean? Well, I titled this class Freedom for What? And the reason I did that has to do with this specific statement I'm about to make. And that statement is this: that according to the Old Testament, the Hebrew people were not set free for the purpose of self-determination, at least not in the contemporary Western sense of that. The Hebrew people were not set free for the purpose of self-determination. Rather, they were set free for the purpose of service. And let's unpack that. I was going to say by looking at the slides, but since we don't have that now, I'm going to read to you again from Exodus chapter 7, verse 16, where God tells Moses to say to Pharaoh, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. Let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness. And then that same concept is repeated in chapter 8 of Exodus. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, let the people go so that they may worship me or serve me. So the purpose of freedom for the Hebrew people is not so that they can do whatever they want for themselves, but so that they can become obedient to God and worship and serve the one true God. People have been set free so that they may serve me, says God, and no one else. The purpose of the Hebrew people's liberation is that they are to be free to serve not a king and not the state, but rather Yahweh. And I hope this shouldn't be a completely foreign sounding idea, I don't think. In fact, this notion of being set free for the purpose of serving God will, for some of us, call to mind that beloved collect for peace from the Book of Common Prayer. It talks about God whose service is perfect freedom. This is a pretty standard conviction of classical or orthodox, if you prefer, Christianity. Namely, this idea that true freedom is to be found not in the quest for the greatest amount of self-determination possible and striving always to do whatever we want, whenever we want, but rather in being obedient to the higher authority of God. Nonetheless, this concept of being made free only to then subject oneself to an outside authority can seem counterintuitive. But again, it's really the essence of what freedom means in the Hebrew Testament. And besides that, when the Hebrew slaves escape from Egypt so that they can be servants of God, they are not just exchanging one form of subjugation for another. For unlike Pharaoh, Yahweh is a loving, caring master, one whose will for the people is that they know justice and prosperity and freedom and peace. Now, the Hebrew people don't always get this, do they, any more than we do? But does anybody remember one of the first things the people become upset about, the Hebrew people become upset about after they pass through the Red Sea into the wilderness? They say, we don't have enough food. Oh, for the flesh pots of Egypt. Take us back to Pharaoh. It was hard, it was awful, but we'll go back if we could just have something to eat. So the people are already becoming enslaved to hunger, to their bellies, to physical need. But what happens? God provides. God sends manna as, among other things, a kind of proof that the people are free indeed. They are so free, in fact, and I think this is important as we get into talking in a little while about the American context of freedom. The Hebrew people are so free that they don't need to hoard the food. They don't need to compete with others for the food. Remember, they try hoarding one night. What happens? The manna goes bad. So God says, you're free. Believe me, you're so free that you no longer have to worry about getting your basic needs met. And who is it who makes this kind of radical freedom possible? It's Yahweh, God, the Lord. Now, the great contemporary German Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann has asserted that, in fact, in the Old Testament and elsewhere, the very expression, the Lord, ergo God, Yahweh, is an assurance, is designed to be an assurance of freedom for enslaved people. Yahweh is the Lord, as opposed to the underlords, whom the Hebrew people have been serving in the past, which brings up to me what is kind of a fascinating topic. You know, in many postmodern Christian circles, using terms like Lord and King has understandably fallen out of fashion, because these terms seem to imply a kind of domination that is not in keeping with progressive Christian values. And this makes total sense to me. I get it completely. Human kings and lords have all too often been agents of oppression and have ruled in a way that is in direct conflict with Judeo-Christian values, and in fact with the values of all the major religions. But what if this whole concept of Jürgen Moltmann's, that using the term the Lord, even speaking it, implies that God's people are free, raises for me the interesting question of what if these terms could actually be terms of liberation if we reimagined them and used them in a different new way, if we understood them as reminders that in God's economy, there is only one Lord, one King, and that is this God who liberates, the God before whom every knee should bow, even and especially the knees of the earthly rulers and the powers that be. But I'm getting off on a bit of a tangent now. That's a whole other topic. But I'm fascinated by words and the words that we use in the church. So that's interesting to me. We'll have to leave that off for another time. But before we move on from the Hebrew scriptures into a quick look at some of the New Testament and what it says about freedom, there are just two other points I want to make about the understanding of freedom in the Hebrew scriptures. The first point, I'm going to click down on my slides here for a minute real quickly. The first point is that for the authors of the Old Testament, the loss of freedom, the absence of freedom, comes from social and economic inequality, and therefore the people of God should work to eliminate these ills. And in chapter 5 of the book of the prophet Isaiah, the prophet is bemoaning those who, quote, join house to house, who add field to field until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. So here the prophet Isaiah is bemoaning the actions of people who take more than they need, thereby taking away basic needs from some of their fellow people. And so this is a basic lament about those who are just overbuilding, as I said. Now, why this concern? Well, because in ancient times, the loss of land and the loss of economic independence could cause a person to become enslaved, literally. If one person came in and took more than their fair share, then their actions could result in their neighbors not having enough land to farm, and then those neighbors could have lose their freedom and could need to become slaves. And the other point I want to make is a related point. It's just an acknowledgement, which you probably already assumed and know, an acknowledgement that a recognition that there were indeed slaves among the Hebrew people, even after the Exodus from Egypt. There were slaves throughout the ancient Near Eastern world. And what the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures make clear though, and you can actually see the development of thinking on these issues as you read through the different books of the Torah, what the Hebrew scriptures make clear is that the Hebrew people recognize the dissonance between their shared theology and their practice. In principle, the Hebrew people's approach to human freedom is far more developed than that of other ancient Near Eastern cultures at this point. For example, in the 21st chapter of Exodus, verse 2, we read, "When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th, he shall go out a free person without debt." Now, this is a reference, you may be aware, to the sabbatical year, which occurred every 7 years. It was kind of a mini Jubilee year, if you're familiar with the concept of the Jubilee year happening every, there's some debate whether it happened in the 49th or the 50th year, but every 7 years, there would be a sort of a Sabbath in which masters were to set slaves free. And so this passage from Exodus, giving this instruction, when you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th, he shall go out a free person without debt. Even more progressive, we see in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, "If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve for 6 years, in the 7th year, again, you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. This is why I give you this command today." This concept of remembering, I just want to add in, always so important for the Hebrew people, but particularly, I think, in this area of freedom and of how we treat one another, the invitation to, the command really, to remember. Then we go on and let me see if I can pull up the screen here. In the book of Leviticus, things alter even more and progress even more in terms of Hebrew treatment and possession of slaves. In Leviticus chapter 25, we read, "If any who are dependent on you," because this was the way that most Hebrew people became slaves, if they had no way of providing for themselves. Most of the Hebrew people's slaves were those who had been captured in war, but Hebrew people were slaves, were the destitute, the poor, those whose land had perhaps been encroached upon by other Hebrews. But so in Leviticus chapter 25, we read, "If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children with them shall be free from your authority. They shall go back to their own family and return to their ancestral property, for they are my servants." Again, here's this theme that the Hebrew people have been set free to be God's servants, not to bow down to any earthly lord or master, but to be God's servants. "For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves or sold. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but shall fear your God." So they're just a cursory look at some of the development and evolution of the thinking around slavery and freedom through the years among the Hebrew people. Okay, well, what about the New Testament? In the New Testament, and we're going to have to go into a lot of this next week because of my technological difficulties. We've not gotten along as far as I'd hoped we would, but just in a cursory way so we can get to I hope some interesting dialogue. In the New Testament, we see a number of ways in which this ancient Hebrew understanding of freedom, freedom as service, is reiterated and developed. In a nutshell, I think these forms of development in the New Testament can really be summed up as followed, that in the New Testament, freedom is freedom to love, okay? Closely related to freedom to serve. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 13, we read Paul's admonition to the Galatians: do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. So again, picking up on the Old Testament understanding of freedom not as an excuse for self-indulgence, for focusing exclusively on self-determination, but freedom as being for the purpose of love and of service. And if you're familiar with the Maundy Thursday liturgy of the Episcopal Church, you know that that's the whole purpose of the foot washing and of the reading that we hear each Maundy Thursday about Jesus washing his disciples' feet, reversing the role of master and servant out of love, to illustrate what love really looks like, which is service. So what then, in short, and then we're going to get to open it up for some dialogue, what can we really say is the central focus of the Bible's teaching about freedom, taking for granted that the Bible says many, many different things in many different ways in many subjects, and is not one big book, but a whole lot of smaller books? I think we can sum up the central focus, the main thrust of the Bible's teaching on freedom by saying that God has set God's people free in order that they may serve or love, if you prefer God, and also serve or love one another. So freedom is really about relationship. It's about right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. Right relationship with God means that God's people do not serve other small g gods, including, for example, mammon. So people are free from the relentless quest for more money, more possessions, more power, more approval, more status, etc., etc. People are also free from the need to be subservient to other human beings, to be in a master-slave or master-servant relationship with their fellow human beings. According to the biblical understanding of freedom, there is not to be one class of human beings who lord it over others, who spread out so much that they take other people's lands, as we discussed earlier. Serving only the Lord, capital L, the one true God, means that God's people are members of one family and have equal status with one another. There's only one master, and that is God. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I may come back in and say a few more things just right towards the end. I know we're getting close to time anyway, but I would love to hear comments, questions, reactions to what I've shared about in a very cursory way about biblical concepts of freedom. And particularly, I'd love to hear any place that sort of dinged a bell for you as you were listening in terms of how the biblical understanding of freedom jibes or doesn't jibe with our postmodern American understandings of freedom. How about, I'll just throw this out here for a minute.
Hold on, I see Jenny raising her hand.
Okay, yes. Jen.
Let's see. Hold on, Jenny, it's still unmuting you. Okay.
What about the issues of husband and wife serving the male, doing what the male says, etc.?
Yes, right, Jenny. I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, I think we may have to have a whole session on that passage from Ephesians that I actually had on my slides to discuss. So we'll come back to that next week. But just in brief, just as I read from different passages from different books of the Old Testament, trying to show some of the evolution in Hebrew thought, and I talked about how there was a wide difference oftentimes between principle and practice for the ancient Hebrews. So for the fledgling Christian communities, basically the passage I was going to read from in Ephesians, yes, is the one that talks about wives being subject to husbands. But in another part of that passage, there's talk about still serving one another and being kind to one another, which again, it doesn't do it for me. I want more than just a little bit of kindness and service. I'm not going to be subject to my husband, but for the time, I think there's a way in which it could still be viewed as slightly progressive. I'm so glad you brought that up, though. I really want to talk about that more next week. I didn't get to do the New Testament justice. But absolutely, I mean, I think, again, as for all of us, always, we have our best ideals, and we're just not always living in a culture that encourages us to live out those ideals.
Julia, I sometimes think about it when praying the Eucharistic prayer B, which is what we used in today's service. I had a classmate in seminary who did not like using prayer B because it says, put all things in subjection under your Christ.
Right.
And so I think that we have to, really explore what subjection means in that context, and the freedom that can come with subjection when it's in the kingdom of God.
Right. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, Lauren. I think that's a great point. Again, I mean, I'm just fascinated. I love language. I was an English major, and I could spend 6 months talking about this whole concept of how these words that came to us out of a monarchical culture can be very difficult and wrong for our use today. And how, on the other hand, I think they present us with opportunities to sort of redeem the time and redeem the language, as it were, to reconsider, as you said, what subjugation means, what lordship means.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, Barbara, yes.
I think sometimes freedom can be scary because a responsibility comes with it to make our own decisions. And so like the Israelites, the minute they're free, they're like, at least in Egypt, we had food. Somebody was taking care of us.
Right.
So it's a wilderness of freedom. So often freedom and wilderness for me have similar connotations, and that we're on our own in ways that we have to be responsible and make our own decisions and be accountable to ourselves and to our higher power might be. So sometimes it's tricky. I think people say they want freedom, but sometimes they want someone to tell them what to do. So they might want freedom, but they might want it in an institution or a structure where, like the priesthood and the bishop.
Yes.
Promise to obey the bishop. There's a little bit of loss of freedom in that. Anyway, I think freedom can sometimes be a scary thing.
Absolutely, which is ironic because I think I oftentimes think of one of the important components of freedom as being freedom from fear. And in fact, I was noting that Theodore Roosevelt, I believe, gave a speech at some point in which he outlined some of the primary principles of freedom as he saw them. And one of the main components of freedom as he saw it was a freedom from fear. But you're right. Especially, I think, in our American culture, that dynamic, the struggle between how much freedom, how much autonomy, and how much authority, that sort of dynamic is very live. On the other hand, on the one hand, we're a culture that seems to want to just say, what is the saying now? You do you, I'll do me. But when we really live into that, there can be a lot of problems, including it can be scary. Mm-hmm.
So Julia, 2 comments. One is from an incognito George Maxwell that speaks to you.
Hi, George.
He says, Thomas Burton said, true freedom is not doing what you want, but wanting what you do and knowing in the deepest center of your being, why you did it. So that speaks to the point you were just making, but then in a different point, Stanley Yawn writes in our chat, I think we also need to think in terms of social organization. It was not long into the Exodus that need was found for organization and temporal authority. Later, the Israelites demanded a king with mixed results. The New Testament suggests a very different organization, often tending toward communality. From this, we get into aspects of liberation theology. It seems to me these notions of social organization are difficult for us in understanding and exercising freedom.
Oh boy, yeah, there's a whole nother class right there. I love it. Who was that from? Stanley, did I hear? Thank you for that, Stanley. Yeah, it's, that's a packed and wonderful comment and reflection. That and George's Merton quote as well. As you're, I'm sure, all well aware, and as we live through on a regular basis politically, we have these struggles and these debates about how we will organize ourselves to care for one another in a democracy, in a free society. Will the government care for people, or will we count on individuals to volunteer to care for one another? Which I think is getting a little bit into this piece you were raising, Stanley. What sort of organization of our society best promotes true freedom? And it also ties into the place of authority that you were alluding to, Barbara, that to live without that, without the sort of level of authority that you've been used to having, can be a scary thing. Other people, I realize we're about at the end of time, and I wanted to read just one quote from John Stuart Mill, whose work in the 19th century I think has informed so much of our ideas about freedom in our Western culture. And he said that the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to attain it. I wonder, just real quickly, how that sits with you in light of what we've been talking about regarding the biblical concept of freedom. What do you think about that? So long as we don't attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to attain their freedom, the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way.
I've been thinking about it. Can you hear me?
I can, Tom, yes.
Okay. I've been thinking about this all along, and it's 2020 in America, and we know what's going on here right now in many different ways. And the elephant in the room to me is slavery and what was going on in the 19th century, in the 18th century in America. And were all the slaves supposed to get up and head for California, I wonder? I mean, this is a real complex thing that I'm bringing up, but I couldn't help but think about freedom in this aspect and slavery in this aspect, and how our country has dealt with these things. They weren't Jewish, and this isn't Egypt, but slavery is slavery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anybody else before I know we need to finish up? I wonder if you're so inclined, if I don't know if you're able to continue to, I guess you can't use the chat function after we finish the meeting, but if you have additional questions or comments, or I'm aware that, boy, our time has flown by, and particularly with my technological problems, there's a lot that I'd like to go back and still cover. I haven't gotten through what I had intended to present today, but some of your questions have really, I think, are going to inform the way I'd like to go for our second class next week. So if you all wouldn't mind, if you have further reflections or comments, could you go on the Cathedral website and find my email address, or I'll give it to you. It's julia.mitchener@cathedralatl.org. And just, I would love to hear from you, things that you would love to hear addressed next week. And because what I'd love to do is to be able to hone in a little bit more on one or two specific areas of focus, because I feel like more than I had intended, we've been kind of all over the page today, and that's my fault for having gotten in late and so forth. But I'd love to hear, particularly on the contemporary side of things, and again, how these biblical understandings of freedom do and don't jive with our contemporary American understandings of freedom, where you would like to see the conversation go along those lines. Tom, I think that the slavery piece you brought up is so important. Barbara, the anxiety piece, the scariness of freedom, and how that plays itself out in our society today. Yeah, Jenny.
I think Barbara's point about anxiety and how to, I think that was so important in what you were adding to it, in terms of not taking away the privilege of somebody else trying to help or help get to the end of the point of what somebody needs. And I think that I think it's hard for me sometimes to know when to step in and when to step out to try to help or all that kind of stuff. And that's about a piece of freedom as well. So if you would mind talking about that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. Yeah. I know we need to get off so that we can, some of us can attend the 11:15 Eucharist, but thank you all for your presence and participation. It's just wonderful to see your faces, and I will get a revised sort of description of what we'll be covering next week. But again, I'd really love to hear from you how you'd like to focus in a little more sharply on any specific topics that we sort of hinted at today. Why don't we finish up, as my experience of OFSS, we always do, by saying the Lord's Prayer.
And I'll unmute everybody so that we can all do it.
Oh, thank you. Excellent.
All right.
Our Father, who art in
heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Amen. Let us bless the Lord, and let us bless Lauren and all of you for your patience.
Thanks.
Have a good week.